Okay, so we're going to be talking about the causes of the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. And if we just flash over to the map, we'll deal with the basics first, okay? So this is a war between, if you want to remember it in a really simple way, it's between the North and the South in the USA. So also, there's a bit of added extra. You've got the new states like California in the West, but mainly this is between the Union in the North and the Confederacy in the South, okay? So if we just go over to the board again here, just a couple of details about these two areas of America that are really important actually, because we're talking very different places. This is a big, big continent, many miles between the North and the South. So in the North, by the early 1800s, what we've got developing is an industrial, factory-based economy, sort of a bit like what you had developing in England at this time, because remember, in Europe and in America alike, the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s is something that's in full swing by this point, and America's no exception to that. So, down in the South, it's very, very different. We don't have the factory-based economy. The economy of the South is propped up by slavery, and it is all about cotton plantations, okay? So these are places that employ huge amounts of slave labour and produce lots of cotton, and that is really how their economy works. Now, at this point, what you'll find is that doesn't necessarily mean that these two places don't complement each other. So, for example, a lot of the cotton that was produced in the South, yes, some of it would have been shipped abroad, but a vast majority of it would have been taken north to, say, for example, textile mills in places like Massachusetts. So, actually, without these cotton production places, the North, really, in its businesses, wouldn't be doing as well as they were at this stage. Now, right now, I'm just going to take you over to, okay, so these two things are complementing each other quite nicely here, but where the problems start is over on this map down here. If we just have a look at this for a moment, because there's some issues with America as it grows, really. So you've got your factory-based economy in the North down here, and you've got your plantation-based economy in the South down here. Now, we've already explained that cotton grown here goes to factories here. So that's not causing a problem. That doesn't mean that the North hate the South. In fact, the North quite rely on the South for the cotton that they produce. So the problem comes as the USA is growing, okay? And this is a time, remember, where the USA is growing from a small amount of territory in the East, as it was in colonial days when it was owned by Britain, to by the end of the 1800s covering the whole continent that we know it now. Now, this problem, and where problems arise, is largely to do with visions. And if we flash across back to the board, we'll see why we get problems here. Because the people in the South saw American expansion as an opportunity, that's the growth of the United States, as an opportunity to take slavery west. So they wanted, as America grew, for slavery to grow with it. Now the people in the North wanted America to grow as well, but their vision for America was very different in that they saw America would grow and the new states would be a free labour economy. So this would be businesses employing people who were paid wages, or small farmers who were prepared to work the land, live on the land and make money through farming, okay? Now that was very different to the idea that you would get a big plantation owner who would employ slaves to do the work for him. So, if we take it back to this map down here, these two visions are going to cause some tension as America grows. And the reason that they're going to cause so much tension is because what it means for the political system in America and government. Okay? Now clearly, as America in the North, the industrial society means that it's more heavily populated than the South. Because this is a rural economy based around plantations, there simply aren't as many people as there are in the industrial cities of the North. Okay? So that worries the South, because the South looks to the North and sees that because they have a larger population, they will have more representation in the US government. Okay, So they were already starting to worry about this as the North grows, that they will lose power. Okay. Now, there's a few things that were done over time to try and make sure that the North and the South stayed relatively equal. Okay, and the first one, if we look back to the board over here, is the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And this Missouri Compromise basically said that as the USA grew, what would happen is 2 new states would be added on each side to keep the balance in government as tight as it possibly could be. So as the North grew west, 2 new states would be added in the North and the South at the same time simultaneously. And it meant that as the USA grew, you would have an equal number of slave states in the South and free states in the North. And the idea was, because each state sent 2 representatives to one of the most important houses in the US government, the Senate, that they would have a roughly equal balance in the US government. The other house, Congress, was based on your population, and obviously the North was going to have a bigger representation in that. But actually, that didn't matter as long as there was a fairly equal representation in the Senate, because the Senate was as important in making decisions as the Congress, if not a little bit more important. So if the North ever wanted to abolish slavery, for example, they had to get the vote of the South to do it, and if the South had an equal number of people in the Senate, then that was never going to happen. So the idea of the compromise was, it was to keep the balance of power equal between the South and the North, okay? So, we're at this situation then where America is growing after 1820s, okay? And the South continues to be worried about the growing power of the industrial North. It's got a bigger population, which means it's got bigger representation in government, okay? This worries the South. It can see a day where it's losing power and it's losing influence, okay? So, the next important step, if we look at the map over here, is 1850. And this is the 1850 Compromise, otherwise known as Henry Clay's Compromise. And in this, there are some important developments to keep the South happy while it's looking to the North, seeing it growing and seeing it looking a lot more powerful than the South. And Henry Clay suggests that California joins the Union, this is an area that's been won from Mexico, as a free state, okay? So slavery will not be allowed in California. But he also suggests that New Mexico, this huge territory over here, would be allowed to decide for itself whether it wanted slavery or not, okay? So that's to keep the slave side happy, that's to keep the free state side happy, okay? Now, one of the key things that really caused a lot of controversy, actually, in this compromise was that they said that something called the Fugitive Slave Law, which basically means any escaped slaves who escaped to the North, it was the duty of the northern states to return them to the South. Now, this really started to ramp up tension in the North. So if we look at the North and we think back to the free labour vision and the abolitionists, the people who wanted rid of slavery, this idea that black Americans who'd escaped to the North had to be returned into slavery, that wasn't particularly acceptable to either of these groups. So we start to get, with the 1850 Compromise, although it's an attempt at compromise, we start to get the tension ramping up a little bit. Now, this isn't helped in the early years of the 1850s by a man called James Buchanan, who was the President of America at this time. Now, in 1854, Buchanan is well known for passing something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, this is significant if we look over at the map, because this is the area we're talking about when we're talking about Kansas-Nebraska. And what the Act basically says is that this new land on the plains in the west should be left to decide whether it wants slavery or not. Now, This is a big, big deal, because what it's basically doing is it is opening up the possibility that slavery could grow beyond the 1820 Missouri Compromise line. So it's therefore possible that slavery could expand not just west but north. Now obviously this is going to upset your free labour people, and it's going to upset your abolitionists. So tension is increased further by this, okay? So James Buchanan authorising this is really a bit of a mistake, okay? Now, going back to this Kansas-Nebraska thing, what we see is we actually see the Civil War in a microcosm here. Because what happens is the slave owners flood Kansas with people who are going to vote in favour of Kansas becoming a slave state. And also at the same time, there are lots of farmers who are trying to set up homesteaders and the like that you might have heard about already, that are trying to set up small farms and have the idea that this will be land for small farmers who want to work hard and make a living. And what happens is this results in a civil war within Kansas itself before the main civil war breaks out later. So this is a sign of things to come, really. The tensions are really erupting in this small area of the USA. Right, now, another thing that James Buchanan does, which really upsets the free labour vision in America, is the Supreme Court decides, this is more the Supreme Court than the President, to be honest, but the Supreme Court decides that on the Dred Scott case, who was an escaped slave, a fugitive slave to the north, that he could not be free, having escaped to the north, where black Americans were free, because he was an escaped slave from the south. So the Supreme Court ruled against giving Dred Scott